Perfect. Okay. So I'm Kriста Bедwin, and I'm going to talk to you about powerful readable English. So what I mean by that is that we will be taking English papers that I receive, as a translation or that people wrote in English in the first place. And then what do we do with them to make the message be more strong and to be more clear? So instead of saying powerful readable, even we could say, how do we make English strong and clear? Because the more strong is your message, the more easy it is for your people to understand, your readers to understand. So we are going to discuss strategies to strengthen your writing, why those strategies work, and some common errors, but I'm not going to focus on common errors. One, because I know you all had lunch and you're sleepy, so I'll try to be interesting. And two, because I think it's more interesting to look at how and why we do this process. So you can see the procedures that we do. Common errors are very easy to have lists of, and we also, I will be giving you 2 books at the end so that you can see lots of common errors inside those notebooks. So I want to tell you at the beginning, some example texts are used. So some slides have many words on the page. Your job is not to read all of the words all of the time. So you will see that just listen to what I'm saying and listen to what I'm describing on the page. And I will take questions at the end also. So a little bit about myself. I have been a professional science editor and writer since 1999 online. And I started with chemistry textbooks and teaching chemistry. And then I began to edit for researchers, so academic papers, including translations. I normally work with translations from French to English, but I've also consulted with colleagues who work with translations from Russian to English, and there's many similarities in that. So I address some of those during this presentation. And then I also work with a lot of consulting scientists and engineers, so people in industry rather than in research. And the 2 textbooks that you will be sent at the end by email, those were written for the consultants, not for academics. They were also, I apologize, written for Canadians, and some of my jokes might not translate, but you can email me and I will explain my jokes. So here's what the 2 textbooks look like. You'll receive them by email. And again, I'm a friendly person and I very much enjoy to hear from my colleagues around the world. I've edited with a lot of people from all over the world. And so if you have a question, please do not hesitate. Just send me an email. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Krista Bedwin on the internet, so I am very easy to locate. So how can you take a paper that you receive back from the translator, or so how will the editor make the paper more strong is what I'm going to show you. So the first thing is use the space well. And this is something that typically academic writers and engineers are not taught to do. We think we have a journal article and we think we must do it straight in order, and that is not the case. In fact, we can use the space in some interesting ways. Just like, if there's a good speech, the speaker pauses and lets you think about it for a little while. It's the same thing with writing. The white space on the page is the sort of silence that lets you learn something. So it's important to think about this as a writer as well. We're going to talk about plain language, which is a clear way to write. And we'll talk about fixing errors and some common errors that you can see. Okay, so I have one piece of homework for you, which is that you should begin a procedure, if you are writing in English, to learn your kinds of errors. So there's 2 kinds of errors in second language. or maybe it's your third or your fourth language, you can learn to fix some of them by yourself. And there's other errors that you, like for me as a French speaker, I think I will never finally get the masculine and feminine correct, maybe by the time I'm 80 years old. You know, sometimes you can just expect to make mistakes. So if I'm writing documents in French, I expect somebody else will need to correct me about that. Same thing if you're writing documents in English, it's good to be humble and understand that sometimes you just need some help. And so if you learn about your own errors, you can begin to improve better by keeping a list of them. And then you can also know when it's good to seek help. Don't always need help, but it's good to know when you do. So the first part, we're going to talk about how to make space and how to use the space. And you're maybe thinking that this has nothing to do with my research, but it has everything to do with your reader. And so it has to do with how well people can receive your message. So it is important. So here we have an email that anybody might type on their telephone. And so when somebody types an email on their telephone, just like when a researcher is writing their research from their own head, they're focused inside their own head. And so this is a weak communication because it's disorganized, it's impolite, and because of that, it's not a good way to deliver the message. So I would work with many engineers who would say, oh, the client does not respond to me, you know, and maybe you have experienced that people don't respond to your emails. Well, there's 5 things we can do to get much more responses to this email. So this is the same words as we had on the last email, but this one is focused on the recipient. And so first thing, there's white space. So you can clearly see there's 3 questions to be answered. And right here, the person says, I need 3 answers, please. As well, the subject of the email, again, you know, maybe you don't think of the subject of the email as a researcher, but your relationship with your colleagues is very important to make good research relationships. And if you are the person who is doing good subject headers, and you say hello, and you say thank you, and you give your contact details, you will get more responses in a better way. So this is a better communication because it's focused on the recipient's needs. It's focused on the person who is reading it. And you should take this same mental shift for when you're delivering your research. What does the recipient need to know? So strong messages must be clear, yet many researchers use, especially young ones, more words, very complicated words, and complicated sentences. And this is a mess. Why? Why do people write messy documents? It's because, and partly, I will also say, partly the process of translation from French or Russian to English or many languages to English, it is always going, because of the nature of the language, it always creates too many English words. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to remove a lot of the extra words. This is not a fault of anybody who is doing the translation or who is doing the writing, but it's just the act of taking it from Russian to English or from French to English. You end up with too many words for a good English communication. So sometimes I work with young scientists and they want to appear more intelligent by using very important words. But we have actually found that the more experienced you are, the better you get at being more concise by using fewer words to say the same message. So the final reason maybe that somebody writes messy documents is that they have not seen this presentation. So once you saw this presentation, maybe we'll find tidier documents. So here's an analogy of what I mean. In the first picture, we don't even see the piano. And it's the same thing you'll see with some of the sentences I show you. We cannot see what is the purpose of the research. Sometimes you have to tidy the room before you can even judge the science. So We need to tidy up the document so we can see what is there. So some studies have been done about experienced writers compared to inexperienced writers. And the more experienced that people become, then they use fewer words, they use simpler sentences, they use the active voice, which we'll talk about soon, and they use white space well. And so this website that I show here, cewriting.org, that website collected thousands of engineering writing, and they found that the more experienced engineers were following these patterns. And so I think we could find the same thing if we did some studies of researchers. So how can we make more white space on the page? You know, obviously with PowerPoint presentations, we use a lot of white space. It's important to understand quickly. So paragraph breaks, bulleted lists, and images. And I know that some of you are saying, oh, we cannot do that in a journal article. It's not permitted. But yes, you can. And I've heard a lot of other people say it's impossible until I show them how. So this is the same email that I showed you before. It's the same text. Pretend that it's a journal article paragraph. So we often have this in research. There's 3 factors of our research, and then there's a paragraph about it. And of course, if it's chemistry research or engineering research or any kind of research, it will often have larger words than this, more complicated structures. We need to use technical language. It's normal. So the first thing we could do is add some numbers to it, the same as we did in the email, right? So I need 3 answers, or in this case, we might be saying there are 3 factors that we considered in our experiment. 1, 2, 3. So when I put those 3 things in, I notice right away they are not parallel. So parallel means, like, if I was organizing the mess onto the shelf, I use the same kind of boxes for each thing and the shelf will look tidy. I don't put everything in a different box. Well, in my house, maybe I do, but let's pretend we want very tidy. So 1, 2, 3, very same boxes. I can see as soon as I put the numbers, I see another problem. And this is the thing about tidying a room or tidying a document. Every layer you see another thing you can polish. Another analogy that I like is, you know, when you're doing a sculpture, you start with your chainsaw and you carve out the bear or whatever you carve out, the eagle, and then you have to take sandpaper and you have to make it finer. And then if you want to take another layer of sandpaper and you make it finer. So you can think of the writing process like you use the chainsaw to do the carving, but then every time you use sandpaper, you know, you have to use a rough grit and then a finer sandpaper and a finer polish. So you can expect it takes sometimes more than 1 layer to unwrap these edits. So when I put it into, you see, I added white space, even though this could be a paragraph in an academic document, you can still add paragraph spaces. People don't. Traditionally, people have not, but we're starting to do it more.
Я секунду назад пришла.
And so here you can see that I've changed it all to 1, 2, 3 sentences in the same format. So that means it's parallel. And often when I do that in academic research, I find that I untangle the sentences when I do that. Also, we can talk about images. So images are good for many reasons. The first one is it keeps people awake even after lunchtime because they become curious. So because they're curious, they get engaged with the text. Instead of being bored and instead of turning off their thing or looking at their phone, they will stay awake. They'll understand it better and faster, and they'll remember it better because the images draw connections between the information. So in academic articles now, more journals are requiring graphical abstracts, and these are fantastic because you can see right at the beginning exactly what's happening in the experiment. It's much faster to understand than when we have to read all the words. So images connect ideas and they save us on words and space. So writers should like images, but writers don't like images sometimes. Why do writers not do images? Because it takes time. However, the good thing is, when you spend that time, you get this magic happening that you begin to understand your own ideas better and you understand your own communication better in the effort of putting together the image about it. And I have one of the professors I work with, he has his younger researchers, he makes them present orally to a meeting, to the group. And sometimes he makes them do it in English to present their ideas. And in the action of preparing to present their ideas to the group, then they understand their paper better and then they can begin to write. So it's worth it to take some time to do images or oral presentations to your colleagues. So here we have an example of an image. So imagine for a second that we did not have the image and we just have those 7 paragraphs on a page. It's very boring and it's difficult. We have to use our imagination, right? We drill 2 horizontal wells, one above the other. First of all, it's not interesting to read these paragraphs. But then second, it can be difficult to get the picture and we might not imagine the correct picture. But because there's an image here, it's exciting. You look to number 1, what's going on in number 1? Then you look to number 1, then you look to the paragraph. Aha, I see, that's what's going on. And then your eye goes down. Oh, look, number 2, what's happening in number 2? And you're excited about reading about the process because you're excited to see what's happening in this picture. So, you can also think of your academic papers sometimes like museum exhibits. If you were a museum exhibit and you were explaining your research in a museum to children, how would you do it? Maybe think about that before the next time you write a paper. So this is all I had to say for part 1, is that smart use of images and space on the page can make your document more clear. Now, part 2, we're going to talk about plain language. So plain language is a movement, an international movement. It's in English. I know it's also in French. I don't know if there's a plain language in Russian, but the point is to focus the communication on the reader. And so when we focus the communication on the reader, we want to make the reading experience a good experience. So we take away all the clutter, we clean up the room. We will go through these 5 procedures that are my main 5 procedures to clean up documents. So sometimes I know people tell me, oh, I don't have to make my writing simple because my readers are very, very smart people. That's true. But if they're smart and they're the CEO of a company or they're the top researcher in their institution, they're also probably exhausted and distracted and very busy. And the smart, even very smart readers, their reading level drops when they're exhausted. So if you are insisting to use very awkward and difficult English and language to describe your ideas, you are insisting that people wait until the morning when they're very awake and in a quiet place before they can read your paper. Whereas if you make a paper that is easy to understand, then people can read it at any time of the day because, well, your research still may be difficult to understand, but it can be less unpleasant. It can be a nicer experience. So a really good description of plain language is not that we're dumbing it down. We are not making it less intelligent. What we're doing is focusing it to the audience. So the same idea is, if you have a car, you will have 2 different books. One book is for the mechanic and one book is for the owner of the car. These people do not need to know the same things. With the mechanic, you're going to use technical language. You're going to assume they have a basic level of knowledge. You will be able to use technical terms. With the car owner, they have a different set of functions to perform. You're not going to assume they know technical details. So that would be more like writing to the public. So sometimes you're writing your research to other researchers. Other times you want to write your research to explain to the public. So you use different language. It doesn't mean that one is less intelligent. It's just different. So as I say, it's enough brain work to understand research. We don't need to add difficult sentences to this difficult job. So surrounding yourself with lots of things might distract you. It's the same thing on our document. So here's a terrible, very messy sentence. And I want to know what you would do with this terrible, very messy sentence. So we have to read this sentence. The ubiquity of nanoplastics and the uncertainties surrounding their hazards and risks to our environment and living beings' health are still unknown and not well understood. I did receive this sentence last week, in fact, in a paper. So I will start to do my procedures to this sentence. The first thing I notice is the word ubiquity is a rare word. It means they're everywhere. Nanoplastics are everywhere. And in fact, apparently it was only 2017 that we began to study them in the Arctic. So they're all over the earth, and we're only now starting to study how ubiquitous they are. So I'm wondering about that word. I'm going to address it. So I just mark it for now. The next word I marked was surrounding, because surrounding is 3 syllables, and I could just say about. And about is easier. And if it's a lot of words in your mouth, it's also a lot of words on a reader brain, even if the reader is reading it silently. So if we can make it smaller and faster to say, it's also faster to understand inside the brain. So then the orange words, this was a very special writer. They had this habit of doing 2 words when they could only use 1. So hazards and risks means the same thing, and still unknown and not well understood also means the same thing. So I think we can cut that in half. And then living beings, the last green word, normally in English, living beings, we're talking about maybe aliens or fairies. In scientific context, it would be better to say organisms. And so, but when you're translating, it's not always possible to know these nuances. Oh, there. So the first thing I do is remove those extra words that we do not need. And so then I look here. I'm just distracted by somebody walking around on my screen. Hang on. Okay. So when I look at the next words, I'm wondering, what can we do about ubiquity now that we sorted out the easiest thing, which is to delete some trash? So there's a very useful tool called Google Books Ngram Viewer. And so Google took millions of books from the last 200 years, and they digitized them, cataloged them. And so you can search them now, and you can put any words that you want to compare into this search bar. And I can see that prevalence, which means almost the same as ubiquity, is a much more common word. So more readers will understand it. And one of my standards for academic writing or any writing is that your reader should not have to go to Google or go to the dictionary all the time. You should try to save them from doing that process. For novels, yes, they can go to the dictionary because that's interesting. But for technical writing, I don't want to be sending them to Google. So let's use prevalence instead of ubiquity, because this clearly shows that prevalence is a better choice. So then we do all of that, and this is a long edit. I apologize for the procedure. But so ubiquity is going to be prevalence, and we now have this, changed it to organisms. The mouse is still not happy. The mouse thinks that it's this man that's walking around. I don't know if I can turn off his camera or anyways. The prevalence of nanoplastics and the uncertainties about their risks to the environment, it's still not a good sentence, because these things mean the same thing. Uncertainties about their risks and still not well understood mean the same thing. And so I stared at this sentence for a long time to try and improve it. And we cannot improve it because we don't even know who is uncertain and who is not understanding. It's in a passive voice. So the easiest thing to do is this miracle called put it into the active voice. We, the scientific community, know little about the prevalence of nanoplastics and the risk they pose to the environment and the health of organisms. Very straight line, perfect straight line. So that is why we call it the active voice, because it has a lot more energy and excitement than the passive voice. And so This is a good idea. Now, some researchers don't want to use the word we, but once I wrote this sentence starting with we, then you can change it. So we could say little is known and go back to that not having the actor, but still we have a straight line sentence because we took accountability for it. That was exhausting. So I have some shortcuts. So the first thing, the whole blue book I wrote as shortcuts for people to edit things before they send to reviewers, because that kind of sentence like we just edited, people send that to the reviewers. And then when I was in an engineering firm, because we wouldn't send it to clients like that, these 65-year-old guys who should only be reviewing the science would be up all night long fixing the English before they could even understand the science or the engineering. And so the blue book that you will receive after the class, it has a lot of procedures about how to do those repairs to the document. So certain problems we can fix immediately, then the other problems are easier to see. So this mouse is telling you to take it easy on yourself. We all write garbage sometimes, like we all put some bad words on the page. Do it anyway. Like even when I read my own writing a week later, I'm like, oh, that's terrible. Don't worry about it. If you write something, then you can revise. So it's better if you can leave some time, if you can sleep on it, and it's also better if you can get a second person to help you revise. So now back to these strategies. How do we declutter? How do we clean these up? So use the active voice. So again, use it, say, we did the science. If you do that, you'll automatically be able to fix the sentence. Remove trash words immediately. We have some charts now about how to use fewer words and elegant words. And then we also want to separate sentences. So another thing my colleagues who work with many Russian translations told me is that because Russian is a more efficient language, you can say things with fewer words. And then when we put that into English, it makes the sentences enormous. And the way to fix the sentence being enormous is to remove words. But it's very common that what you could say in one sentence with Russian needs to be 3 sentences in English. So after the translation, we might have to then separate the sentences. The same thing in French. I often separate some sentences there. So in the green book that you will receive, I talk much more about active voice because it's an important topic. So a passive voice is to say the horse was ridden. Who was riding the horse? Okay, the horse was ridden by the woman. Okay, but even better, why don't we just say the woman rode the horse? It's more direct, you see? So the last sentence is active. Now this one might look more familiar to you. The tests were performed. I have seen this sentence hundreds of times. Well, who performed the tests? Okay, the tests were performed by our group. But why say it that way? Turn the sentence around the right way and say, we performed the tests. Or if you don't want to say we, our group performed the tests. This is easier for an English reader to understand. So the sentence ends up being backwards if you don't just say it in a straight line. So how do I know a clue that it's backwards is these words were. You see, were, and also in translation from French, I often see has been and have been used a lot that we almost never will use in English. Sometimes we do, but much more rarely. And so when I see these words, which are forms of the verb to be, that means that we can improve the sentence and shorten the sentence. I call it a red flag. So instead of saying the poem was an explosion of energy, we can say the poem exploded with energy. It's much more exciting. You know, if you look at the sentence, my aunt is an editor, maybe you see an old lady sitting there at the table, or you see her wearing a hat. If you say my aunt edits, it's more active. The picture in your brain is more exciting. And so again, the reader stays awake even after lunch. And I hope you guys are still awake. I will know if you have questions at the end if you stayed awake. So When it's fewer words, again, extra words put people to sleep. So the first thing we want to do is just delete these words. So for example, with trash words, when I see the words however and therefore, and it should be noted that, and some writers use these more than others. So I'm not exaggerating, but one paper I received, there was 37 cases of therefore. And so I just went into Word and I looked up every example of the word therefore, and I deleted all except for 3 of them. So sometimes we need the word therefore, sometimes we need the word however, but usually writers use them much more than required. So those are words that we can get rid of and automatically you have a sleeker reading experience. And wordy phrases and deletable words that you can are in the green book. I have 5 pages of a list of these words that we can just delete completely or reduce. So maybe you have seen papers that said something like, we undertook to perform an analysis of our substrates. You know, they just mean we analyzed the substrates. Instead of saying within a comparably short period of time, we could just say soon. And again, it's easier. And yes, you sound just as smart with this small word. Young people that I meet, at least in Canada, they think that they will sound much smarter if they use these big, fat phrases. So put it on a diet, use the skinny phrase. Another very common one that I delete many, many times per paper is people say in order to, and just saying, instead of just saying to, they say in order to. So I might see in order to in some writers, maybe 8 times, and maybe I'll keep one of them. You just don't need to keep on putting those extra words. So here's an example that I want you to take a look at and tell me what you would do with this. So we have a few chats. I'll check the chats at the end. So the review proposes to focus on the research and more specifically, we'll point out their specificities as revealed by the most recent works reported within the literature. So right away, I see the red flags. I see the things we can throw out of this. Again, I got this last week. I had a really rich week last week for crazy sentences. So basically, if I see specifically in specificities 2 words with the same root, I know that we can delete at least one. In this case, why don't we just call them details? Because that's what they mean. Another red flag, we don't use within in English very often. It's a specific term within, and we wouldn't use that here. So I get rid of that right away. The next thing I notice is that we have research as a noun, and then we have most recent works as a noun. And actually, they're talking about the same thing twice when I look at it. So we can get rid of that. And another thing is this revealed by is often overused by researchers, which we don't really need. So I look at that. So this review proposes to focus on the details of recent research initiatives reported in the literature. Okay, and I put the word initiatives as a noun to be descriptive. But then a geologist friend of mine looked at it and I thought, you know, I don't even really need the word initiatives. And then he said, you don't even really need all of this. You could just say the details of the recent literature. So some people might find that too concise, or maybe that would be comfortable. Geologists would like it. So even if you use my longer version, look how many words are saved. So if you're an exhausted reader, just imagine how much less bored you're going to be if you can get through it more quickly. You know, our readers don't want to give us prizes for giving more pages. Although I did have some Italian colleagues who were telling us that I think their clients were paying by the number of pages in the report. So in that case, they were adding more pages to the report, but that was a bit of a crazy system. And that they said that that client wasn't the normal one. So again, in the book, I have some lists of how to make the words more elegant and stylish. Okay, So people, again, often the young writers who want to sound more authoritative, so they try to use bigger words. And one of the favorite big words is utilization. I always go in and annihilate this word. I just get rid of it and use the word use. It's so elegant. It's like a French girl in a beautiful, simple dress. You just need use. Instead of necessitate, we can just say need, instead of, well, enumerate might sound nice now and then, but you could also choose the simpler word list. Now, one that's outright incorrect is that people often want to say they used a methodology instead of a method because they think it sounds great to have a methodology. Well, in fact, a methodology is a collection of methods. So if in fact you dissolved your substrate and then you checked the pH and then you ran it through a spectrophotometer and then you precipitated and then you get the idea, you did many steps, that's a methodology. But if all you did was dissolve it in water, that's just a method. So you don't get to use the bigger word just because you want to sound good. So how can we make these elegant words? So the interesting thing is the elegant word on the right-hand side of that table also goes with simpler sentences. So you can often shorten sentences and make reading easier by taking these parts of the word off. So ATION particularly, I often go into a paper and I just search for all the words that have ATION, and I will find a lot of sentences that I can skinny down because they're almost always doing something like this. So the conclusion was reached. So you could write, we concluded, but because they took concluded, which is a verb, and they changed it into conclusion, the noun, they had to add back another verb. So then you need to add 2 more words to the sentence. It's just crazy. So instead of saying the conclusion was reached, I'll look and see the word conclusion, and I'll see the word was, which is another hint that the sentence is too long. And then I can just skinny it right down to we concluded. And you can study this further. This exact procedure is in the notes that you're receiving after the class. So I know this might be going very quickly. I hope you're awake still. So speaking of going quickly, this graph is only going from 1520 to 1950. But if we extend this graph to 1350, so Chaucer was the first writer that wrote things all in English, they say. His sentences were 82 words long. So you can imagine that's like 7 or 8 lines. It's like an entire half of a page almost. Nowadays, with the internet, even simpler than 1950, the average sentence on the internet is only 8 words in English. So when you're writing a research paper, of course, you need more complicated sentences than a lot of things on the internet. However, you need to be aware that people now are used to reading the internet, and shortening the sentences can make their life easier and make the reading faster. So do it. It's a good idea. So this is about our brain. So a sentence that ends in a period is easy to read. Our brain turns this into a package. Okay, this whole thing here only has 1 period at the end. That's also a whole entire package. So our brain has to hold all of these details in their brain at the same time. And so long sentences with many semicolons and parts can be difficult to process. Semicolon. In this case, our brains need to hold all the details at once, and in English, this is difficult. So, and these kind of sentences often result from translation, but we don't need to keep them as 1 package. We can turn that into 3 packages. So all I did between the top, which is our original sentence, and the bottom is I put in 2 periods. So that's 3 packets now. It's like I took a giant box of clutter and I put it into 3 file folders. And our brains can process that more easily. And I also use this. So of course, in your scientific research, those sentences are full of scientific terminology and acronyms and many other things. So what I often do is when I have a paragraph like that that's difficult is I just hit return after every sentence I untangle the sentences separately, and then I put it back together. So this is a strategy that you can use if you are having to review somebody's scientific paper and it's a giant mess, then you can use this strategy to help get some white space and to help make it easier on yourself to read. So the summary of the second part is we should use the active voice and remove the extra trash words. We should use fewer words and elegant words. And again, in the notes that you'll get afterwards, we have more lists about how to do that. And we should separate the sentences and simplify the sentences. So basically, we want to declutter things. We want to make it shiny and tidy, and then we can understand the ideas more easily. So here's a quiz for you, the final quiz. What's wrong with this? And then after this quiz, I finished before the hour, even though we started late. So I hope we have some time for questions. What's wrong with this sentence? Studies and reviews were published during the last years to tackle the lack of nanoplastic knowledge without being genuinely successful. Again, I received this as a gift last week, this sentence. Now, if you were Americans in my regular webinars, I would get you to type the answers in the chat. I don't know, can we get people to type answers in the chat? I'll show you the answer. Next webinar, I'll make you do it in the chat. Oh. So first thing we see in that sentence is that we have the word were and we have the word being. So those are two red flags, like I told you, that when I see those two words, I know we can make the sentence shorter. The next thing I see is during the last years. That just means the word recent. So we don't need to use 4 words, we can use 1. Here, number 4 is negative. So some of my writers use this a lot, the lack of knowledge. I think it's a common thing in research circles to say we have a lack of knowledge about this or a lack of knowledge about that. But when you're presenting that, we do have to know where our gaps in knowledge are, because that helps us to get a research direction. But it's not a good way to communicate our ideas. So when I clean up all of that, we get recent studies and reviews on nanoplastics have not been very successful. So even that without genuine success was a very long phrase. So I did keep the double word of studies and reviews because, of course, studies might be experiments and reviews are just discussing experiments other people did. So I did decide to keep the double word in this case, but it's still faster, just like when I taught mathematics to school kids, it's faster to show your work than it is to sit around thinking about what the work is. So it's still faster when I'm editing something to flag that and then go back and review it, rather than just try to skip over the step and think through everything at once. The nice thing about the procedures in the notes is you can just apply the procedures over and over, and it's faster than, I mean, you have to think at the same time, but the procedure helps you to think faster. So then I do have some common errors, but because our time is short, I think I'm just going to talk about the types of errors. So as I told you at the beginning, the homework that you have from this session to take with you for the rest of the year until the next conference is to start to keep a list of your own personal errors. Start to notice what things you do. So I notice, for example, when I'm writing emails, I use exclamation marks to be extra happy. So I go back before I send the email, I delete them. So when you become aware of your errors, then it becomes quick to fix them. Common errors are sentences that are turned backwards. You might have a habit of using semicolons and long sentences. I've cured many patients with this illness of semicolons. Passive voice to be verbs, trying to make more. You don't have to make every sentence in your reports active voice, but you can make more of your sentences active voice. You might use extra words, like that one writer I have who's often using 2 words when she only needs 1. And then a specific one that's common for translated papers is that it and them show up instead of the specific word. And I have some examples of that I could show, but I think I prefer to take questions first if we have any. And if we don't, I could show a couple examples of the it problem. So there's two kinds of errors. There's the errors you can learn to fix by yourself. And then there's the errors that you can't really see, which I talked about. So the ones that you can fix by yourself are like to learn idioms. So again, this is a common one that editors want you guys to know to not do anymore. You cannot say allows to. Allows has to go with us. This allows us to measure the pH, or allows the researchers to measure the pH. I feel myself fine today, or how do you call this? Can you say me the way to the train? You can learn these phrases over time of studying a language, right? The one that is harder to learn is where to put the and a and the small preposition words, the order that words go into. So I was waiting Olga on the theater should actually be I was waiting for Olga at the theater. That's my grandma's name. I like that name. So my personal example, as I said, is the problem of masculine and feminine in French. So I don't feel like I'm a worse person because I need help with that. And also researchers should not feel like they're worse people because they struggle with the and a. My editing colleagues and I have seen a lot of very smart people that for 2 or 3 decades cannot get these correct. Even after living in Canada for 30 years, some people will just always have difficulty with this. So just get help. That's all. I know there's another session right after me. I didn't know if I should offer my Zoom meeting for further questions. We could do that if people wanted to, or I think we have a few minutes that people could ask questions in the chat or turn their cameras on. I guess we don't have a moderator, so you're just going to have to speak up yourself. Maybe ask me some questions. Yeah, and somebody has said we are running out of time, so I know. So you could, if anybody would like to meet in the Zoom room, maybe just say so in the chat, or email me later. Nobody's saying in the chat. Maybe everybody fell asleep. I don't know. Is anybody here? I cannot hear anybody. Yes. Yes. That's lucky. So just contact me later if you would like to, and have a good, enjoy the next presentation also. Okay. Yes. So software, yes, perfect it. And it's also in the notes. Sorry, am I still speaking properly? So somebody was asking, is it true that you're not allowed to use I or we in sciences? And my answer is that's not true as it used to be. In the past, that was true, but now more journals are allowing people to use I and we, and also are allowing active voice. I asked the European Association of Science Editors, which I belong to, I asked in the group, does anybody in their journal require only passive voice? None of them say you can only use passive voice. So some people still don't want to see we, but all of them, you can definitely use active voice. And I'm glad it was useful. And again, do contact me. I'm happy to hear from colleagues always. So thank